Good morning, everyone. It's been a while since I've been in front of you all. Never gets any easier. But yeah, it's good to be all together again. We've been on holidays for quite a while, and it's good to be with you all again. So today I'm going to talk about something that's actually very much in line with what we've been singing about. It's about faith. It's something that actually I was meant to talk about end of November, I think, or beginning of December. But I got sick before the Sunday that I had to talk, and I think God must have some sense of humor or sense of irony, because I was planning on talking about faith, and as a lot of you know, end of November I lost my job. So he was probably thinking, okay, you're going to talk about faith, so you're probably going to have to put it into practice before you talk about it. Thankfully, I already have a new job now, so God has been faithful. But yeah, I wanted to read a passage from Luke chapter 8, verses 24 and 25. Yeah, it's very well known. The disciples went and woke him up, shouting, "Master, Master, we're going to drown." When Jesus woke up, he rebuked the wind and the raging waves. Suddenly the storm stopped and all was calm. Then he asked them, "Where is your faith?" The disciples were terrified and amazed. "Who is this man?" they asked each other. "When he gives a command, even the wind and the waves obey him." So I kind of wanted to take this passage and break it down into 3 or 4 points, 3.5 maybe, and to kind of focus on, so how can we have faith in turbulent times? How can we act in faith when we're facing a storm of this kind, and we're going through difficult circumstances? So as I said, I wanted to break it down in 3.5 points, and the first one is something interesting, that faith actually takes deliberate action from us. Based on what we read here, faith is very obviously the opposite of what his disciples were experiencing. They were panicking, they were afraid that they were going to die. So obviously, if Jesus is telling them, "Where is your faith?" it's obviously the opposite of this reaction. But it's also probably not what most of us think, because one of the things that I find interesting of this passage is that once Jesus rebukes them and the storm has subsided, he asks them, "Where is your faith?" He doesn't tell them, "Oh, you who don't have any faith, why don't you have any faith?" He says, "Where is it?" So that kind of gives us a clue that they already had the faith that was a gift from God, but they weren't putting it into practice, they weren't using it. And a lot of us maybe think that faith is similar to our central heating. Like, we put the thermostat, probably this winter we put it to 15, not to 25, because it's too expensive. But we put it to a certain temperature, and when it gets cold outside, and it reaches that threshold, then the heating is going to kick in and keep us warm. Again, maybe this winter not very warm, but it's good enough. And maybe we often think that this is what faith is like. We think that it's something we just have, and when we're facing a storm, we're facing problems, it's just going to automatically kick in. But based on what we read here, it's not necessarily like that. One thing that I wanted to remark is that even though we need to take action, we need to understand that faith is a gift from God. And if we read in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 8, it says, "For it is by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not from yourselves, It is the gift from God. So faith is a gift from God, but we mustn't just rest on this, that God has given us faith. We need to put it into action. We need to use it. So when we're faced with these kind of circumstances, when we're faced with problems, we need to remember that we have faith from God. It's a gift from Him, but we need to put it into practice. It's not going to just automatically kick in. So that's my first point. My second one is the object of our faith shouldn't be just the concept of faith in general, just as an abstract term, but the object of our faith needs to be in Jesus. Because we can have faith in many things. We can have faith in politics, in government, in our job, but our faith needs to be rooted in Jesus. And in verse 25, it says, the disciples are speaking to each other and asking themselves, who is this man? He speaks to the wind and the waves, and they obey him. So they're in awe of his power. It even says that they were a bit afraid because of what they saw. And this is what they should have been focusing on all the time. They should have, instead of looking at the storm, at the waves, and thinking we're probably going to drown, they should have been focusing on Jesus and what they knew of him. They should have remembered all the things that they knew of him as they had been walking with him. They had seen him feed the 5,000, 4,000, I can't remember exactly. They saw him raise the dead. They saw him pledge his love to them. And yet it looks like they forgot all these things when they saw the storm. So instead, if they would have just stood for a moment and thought, wait a minute, we know this about him, we know that about him. We know that he is going to be here for us and we shouldn't be afraid. And so this kind of leads me to a kind of subtopic within this point. And it's something I found quite interesting and I've kind of learned over the years, is that thinking leads to faith. And what do I mean by this? Because contrary to secular or popular belief, usually we tend to think that faith and thinking are kind of opposite. They don't go together. Like we think, if I do too much thinking, then I'm going to lose my faith. And actually, it's quite the opposite. If we read a very well-known passage in 2 Corinthians, when Paul is saying, we walk by faith, not by sight. He's contrasting faith with sight, not with thinking or with reasoning. And if you think about it, I tend to lose my faith when I'm looking at the circumstances. They lost their faith because they were looking at the storm, they were looking at the waves. And actually, because they weren't thinking, because they weren't reasoning, they lost their faith. So this kind of gives us a clue that we need to spend time reasoning, we need to spend time thinking about who God is, what he's done for us. We know he's an all-powerful God and he loves us. So if we spend time meditating on this and thinking about this, this will make our faith grow. And one example I found about this, which was I thought it was a good illustration, is that this person was talking about he went to a doctor's checkup, and something came up that during this checkup that he needed to have a small operation. The doctor explained to him, very, very simple operation. It just needs local anesthetic. You don't need to go to the hospital for it. And he gave all the explanation. Okay, this person said, it seems I'm sold. Let's do it. It seemed very reasonable. But he talks that when he actually came to the doctor to have this operation, and he says, you start looking around, you see all the knives, you start smelling the smells, and you start panicking because your eyes are seeing all these things, and okay, you start forgetting what the doctor had told you. And he was saying, I'm not panicking. I'm not starting to be afraid because I have new evidence to suggest that this is going to go badly. It's because my eyes are seeing things and my emotions are kicking in, my fear is kicking in. And what I should do is go back to what the doctor told me and explain this is very simple, there's no risk here. But when we start being guided by what we see and not by our reason, by remembering what we know, we start to lose our faith, we start panicking. I thought this was a good way of putting it. And for example, when I lost my job in end of November, and I told Jessie, my wife, it was a big shock because we weren't expecting it. And we had all these things coming up. We had Christmas coming up. We had a lot of family coming to visit us. We had a month-long trip to Argentina in the beginning of January, all these things. And when we started thinking about all these things, we probably panicked a bit. But then we started remembering, we had already gone through this 2 years ago, where I lost my job again during the pandemic, but God provided an even better job. And we started remembering our families have gone through hardship, both our families, and God has always been there, He's always provided. And so when we start remembering these things, that God is never going to leave us, we start having peace again. But I started looking for a job, I applied, and things started going well, but when we start looking at our circumstances, we look at at our bank account, how much money we have left, and all the things that might happen, you maybe start to doubt again. So we need to remember what God is to us and what He has said, His promises. We have to remember these things, and our faith will grow. And one final example that we can find in the Bible, another very well-known passage, is from Matthew chapter 6, verses 25 to 33, where I think Jesus is kind of making the emphasis to His followers, like, remember this. I'll read it. It says, "That is why I tell you not to worry about everyday life, whether you have enough food and drink or enough clothes to wear. Isn't life more than food and your body more than clothing? Look at the birds. They don't plant or harvest or store food in barns, for your heavenly Father feeds them. And aren't you far more valuable to Him than they are? Can all your worries add a single moment to your life? And why worry about your clothing? Look at the lilies of the field and how they grow. They don't work or make their clothing, yet Solomon in all his glory was not dressed as beautiful as they are. And if God cares so wonderfully for wildflowers, they are here today and thrown into the fire tomorrow. He will certainly care for you. Why do you have so little faith?" So I think this is another good example where Jesus is kind of making the emphasis. Why don't you just stop and think? Look around you. If God cares for the birds, He cares for the flowers, how much more is He going to care for you, that He loves you so much? So we need to stop and think and remember what God says in the Bible. And one thing I found encouraging is to see that obviously our faith grows in our life as we mature as Christians, so that's at least what should happen. We may have our ups and downs, but hopefully as we grow and we mature as Christians, our faith will also grow. And if we look at the example of Abraham, who was the father of faith, if we look at chapters in Genesis where one of the cases where he lacked faith, or he showed very little faith, was this when he's in Egypt and he visits can't remember who he was visiting, but he was afraid because his wife Sarah was very beautiful, and he told her, if they know that you're my wife, they're going to kill me and they're going to take you. So he told her to lie and to say that she was his sister. And then we carry on reading and we see that he shouldn't have done this. Pharaoh, I think it was Pharaoh, told him, why have you lied to me and told me that she's your sister? Now, please go, take your things and go. So this is an example where the father of faith, at the beginning of his journey, maybe was showing a lack of faith. But then we carry on reading, and he reached a point that his faith was so strong that he was willing to sacrifice his only son Isaac, because he had reached a point in his life where he knew God so well, and he knew God's character, he knew his promises, he knew that God was never going to leave him, and if God is asking for this, then he's going to provide. So I think this also gives us a clue that our faith grows as we get to know Jesus better, and we get to know that we've been through things in life, we know he's delivered, he's been faithful, and he's never let us go. So we need to also be encouraged that even though we may not have a very strong faith now, it will grow as we get to know him better. And this leads me on to my third and final point, and I think the most important one, which is we need to remember his love for us. In another version, another chapter of Mark, where it's going through this same story of the disciples in the storm, in chapter 4, verse 38, it says that the disciples also said, "Master, don't you care that we're going to drown?" So it's slightly different to the one we just read. They're thinking, "Don't you care that we're going to drown?" So essentially they're thinking, "You don't love us." And in this case, they obviously didn't know what we know now, that Jesus went to the cross and died and faced the biggest storm anyone could ever face. He was crushed by our sins. He was abandoned by his Father. And yet he was willing to go through all of this when he was faced with a choice. He was willing to do it because of his love for us. In Romans chapter 5, verse 8, it says, "But God showed his great love for us by sending Christ to die for us while we were still sinners." And so not only should we take action, we need to be deliberate when we want to exercise our faith. We need to remember who Jesus is, what he's done for us, what we know about him. It also says in the Bible that our faith grows as we hear his word, as we read about him. So we need to do all those things, but the most important one is we need to remember his love for us. We need to know that he died on the cross, that he went through the worst of storms because he loved us and he wanted to save us to have eternal life with him. And so if we can do these three things, even though they might be difficult when we're facing a storm, we can face anything because we know that he's always going to be with us while we go through the storm. So I hope this encourages you when you face the next storm, as it has been for me as we faced this last storm. There's going to be many more, but we should remember that he's always going to be with us.